Hi, hello, welcome back to my channel. My name is Cheryl, and sometimes I like to read books, and by sometimes I mean I like to read books all the time. I also sometimes like to make videos and talk about all the books that I've read. So today's video is going to be a fun one, and I have actually been looking forward to filming this video for quite some time now. I've talked about it in a couple of my videos in the past, but today's video is actually just going to be talking about the books that inspired me as a kid to read more. I have to admit, so I read a lot when I was younger, but then, I don't know, I did that thing that most teenagers do where once you reach like 14 or 15, you're like, reading is for losers, and then decided that I didn't ever want to read again. I spent all my time on social media. I did things like going outdoors sometimes, which is wild, I know. No, I actually do enjoy going outside. Everything was a higher priority than reading during that time of my life. But there were a couple of books that held true, that kept me reading even during that time. I stopped for a while, and it wasn't until a few years ago that I picked up reading again as an adult. So I just wanted to talk about those books that when I was younger, you know, the ones that I hold near and dear to my heart of like my childhood books and the books that inspired me. So maybe if you know someone that's younger, a little reader that is looking for good books, maybe these will be good recommendations. None of them are anything particularly new, obviously, because I was a child a long time ago. Let's go ahead and get into it. I'm going to start with the books that impacted me the least, all the way up to the books that impacted me the most, and I'll kind of talk about my experience with each one as we go. My first series that I read was Leven Thumps, baby. We used to read books together as a family, and when we were all young, me and my siblings, we would just gather around and he would read us books. So I wasn't doing the reading. I think I was literally like 4 or 5 when he would do this. And so I myself didn't read Leven Thumps, but I remember absolutely loving gathering around. And I think there came a point when it was literally just me and my brother. I don't even remember who else was there. I don't remember what siblings actually stayed and joined, but I was engrossed and I loved it. And so my dad would read us series, and Leven Thumps was the first one that I really remembered. If I'm being real, I couldn't tell you much about the series, and I think this would be fun to maybe go back and reread it again. I don't know exactly if I would like it if I were to read it again as an adult, but I do remember Leven Thumps himself. I remember liking the magic system, and for some reason, I remember a little talking twig in my head. And I think I remember he had like a lot of power. Like, I don't remember much about the story, but I do remember I loved reading with my dad. And so that book series was a bit of a catalyst of me starting to read on my own. So while the series itself didn't impact me that much, it was what the series represented. It was who I was, and it kind of helped shape me as a person. And like, genuinely, that's something I hope to do with my kids as they get old enough to start to understand. I would love to sit down and read with them. It's something my brother does with his son. That is Leven Thumps. This next series, this was one of the first ones that I picked up on my own. Yeah, I must have been in like 3rd or 4th grade. I don't quote me on that. I know you were planning on it, but don't quote me on the exact timeline of when I picked that series up. I read Fablehaven and that whole series, and that was the first one that I really read on my own. And I remember asking my mom to drive me to the bookstore so I could get the next one. And I just remember loving it. And I couldn't tell you much about the story itself, but I just remember the mystery. I think there was a little girl that went to this home, and she slowly started to realize that there was magic that surrounded the home. And like every summer she went back. Very vague, because I haven't read it since then. This was one I only read once, but I remember it kind of gave me that same love and excitement towards reading of what's going to happen next. And I want to find out what's happening with these characters. And it felt very real to me in that moment. And so this was one that, again, really instilled that love of reading for me. My parents still have all the books, and this is one that hopefully I'll get to introduce to my kids one day. The next ones that we're getting into, I have a little bit more to say about them because I was a little bit older as I started to read them. This next one is one that we were required to read for school, and normally I was the girly I know I'm talking about like how much I love books, but you'll notice those first two were still very much like escapism, fantasy stories. There was not a lot of realism happening in the books that I was choosing to pick up. The books that they typically made us read in school, while they were amazing books, I didn't feel the same love for them because they felt a little too real. That sounds so dumb. But this was one of the first books that I picked up where I realized like I actually really enjoy some of these stories. And so we were required to read To Kill a Mockingbird in 9th grade, and we had to do like a book report and a whole big thing. This was the first book for school that I really picked up and read all the way through, and I didn't spark notes. Don't sue me. If my English teachers are saying this, which I know they're not, because this is still a baby channel, but if my English teachers are saying this, no, you didn't. And no, you didn't hear me just say that. But To Kill a Mockingbird, I read the whole book all the way through, and I loved it. And I remember it did make me think about some things that I never had to think about, because I live in a part of the country where everyone pretty much looks the same. Not that I didn't know that people of different skin colors existed, but it just wasn't on the forefront of my mind all the time. And so this was a really cool story because it made me think about things that I never really had to think about before. And I love the story. I remember making a super fun little video with my good friends. It was like, this was our book report. We had to just make a little summary of the story or like talk about some of the themes. And we literally made like a play of To Kill a Mockingbird in their home. And it still, to this day, is one of the cheesy little family videos that we'll randomly send each other and be like, do you remember when we did this? Because that was super embarrassing and no one else can ever see this ever again. But it was a lot of fun to do. I have fond memories of that book. I have reread it since then, just like once, and it was a while ago. But that is To Kill a Mockingbird. We're getting into the top 3. We are in the top 3, everybody. This series, and to the general surprise of no one, that these are my top 3 series, but this next series is Harry Potter. I was kind of mentioning my dad would read us stories when we were younger, and before Leven Thumps, he did this with my older brothers where he read the entire Harry Potter series. And I think we've talked with him since then, and he was like, yeah, it was really fun for the first 2, and then you get into the 3rd and it starts getting like darker and darker. And my brothers were still pretty young. I was either not born yet or like a super baby. So I don't remember this portion. I'm pretty sure the only one that I remember him reading, and it was like right before Leven Thumps, was Harry Potter book 7. And at this point, my older brothers were old enough to understand the story, and they were invested enough that they were like begging him to read the 7th book to us. And so he read the 7th book. I remember that portion, but afterwards, as I was getting older, I would read this. I just read the series on my own, and I loved the story, and it was just so fun. So much so to the point where I would literally every summer, it became a tradition where I would go to soccer practice from 8 to 12 every day. I'd come home, I'd make myself a bowl of cereal, I'd sit out on our deck, and I would read Harry Potter for the next like 2 hours. And so every summer I reread the entire series, and I think I did that for 4 or 5 years in a row. Like I read that series all the time. And it was so fun. One of the things I have to credit, there is a podcast called Potterless that my husband started listening to originally. He told me about, and I started listening to it, and it was just really fun to revisit that story that I read when I was younger. I think that podcast played a role in me starting reading again as an adult. And so it's been a lot of fun just to, like, it was, the whole point of that podcast is you're listening to someone who's an adult who has never read the Harry Potter series and doesn't know much about it, and he's reading it for the first time, and he's sharing his thoughts in real time as he's reading it. It's a few years old now, so you can listen to all of his thoughts like now if you really wanted to. It's a really fun podcast to binge. That series, it's always had a special place in my heart, and I know things are kind of weird now with J.K. Rowling. I won't get into all of the politics of all of that, but as a child, that series meant a lot to me, and it was a lot of fun. I'm not going to waste any of my time or yours explaining the series because I'm pretty sure the entire world knows the wizarding world of Harry Potter. So there you go. Sorry, editing Cheryl here. Excuse the lighting and excuse everything that looks a little unplanned because it is, but I realized when I was filming this video that I did not talk about a super important book series that I can't believe I missed, but It's The Hunger Games by Suzanne Collins and the trilogy that is included in that. And if you want to include The Ballad of Songbirds and Snakes, you totally can, even though I didn't read that until I was an adult. I loved The Hunger Games. I believe Mockingjay came out when I was in like 7th grade or 8th grade or something like that. So I breezed through Hunger Games itself and Catching Fire so that I could read that, because that's what all of my friends are talking about. And the funny thing is, the first time I read this book series, I loved it because it kept me reading. It felt like just like a movie, like I could not stop. I'm pretty sure I read Hunger Games in one sitting, but I didn't really understand a lot of the deeper messaging behind it. So I've reread it a couple of times since then. Every time I read it, I feel like I get a little bit more out of it. But this book series was pretty significant when I was younger, because this felt like genuinely the cool thing to do. I feel like one of the hard things that I struggled with when I was younger was that reading was not considered the cool thing, if you want to say. And so I kind of wanted to hide that part of myself, but I feel like reading Hunger Games was the cool thing to do. It kept me involved and engaged in reading, and I have since overcome that mindset. Reading is freaking awesome. I don't care what anybody else says. I was there watching the movie, and the funny thing is I actually thought that movie was terrible. No, I actually thought that movie was just okay. I didn't like the shaky aspect of it, the rawness of it. It wasn't what I envisioned, but as I've watched it again, I've recognized some of the older and more mature themes that were in that story. So those movies have also aged very well, just like the books have. So those are another series that I think influenced a lot of my reading when I was younger and in those teenage years. Hi, Toby. Also, I have to include this. I've got a couple zits. Please don't judge me for them. Let's just pretend that they're not there. Please and thank you. Okay, bye. Now to the top 2. And I know Harry Potter is great and I do love it, but it is not my top series. Those belong to the world of Percy Jackson. And surprise, surprise, the top 2 series, you have PJO and Heroes of Olympus. Number 2 is PJO, and here's why. Sorry, I gotta get comfy for this one. I read Percy Jackson and the Olympians. I think it was one of my friends in 5th grade introduced me to the series, and that was right before book 5 came out. And oh my word, like that series had me in a chokehold. I picked up book 1 and did not stop until I finished book 4. And then I sat in anticipation for a couple months with my friend until book 5 came out. We went to the freaking bookstore together. We bought it. We read it within the weekend and we talked about it. And I kid you not, in my 6th grade year, I'm pretty sure I read that series like 10 times. We just kept reading it over and over and over again. And it got to the point, I feel a little unwell telling you this. There was a group of us that did this, by the way. It wasn't just me and this girl, but there were a few of us that were super into the series. We would literally like read a portion out of a book and we couldn't see the other one. And we would have to say like what book it was, what page it was on, and what was happening in the story around that line of dialogue. And like we could do it. That was a fun game that we would play. How weird is that? But we loved the series. We went and saw the movies together. We cried together about that whole debacle. So I love PJO. And shamelessly, I will also say that Percy Jackson was my first crush, hands down. And if you look at who I married and the description of Percy Jackson, they're not that far off. So I do have a type, and I think that most of it has to do with Percy Jackson himself. Heroes of Olympus, this sits at number 1 for a very specific reason, and it is because I loved, more so than watching Percy in the first 5 books that he's in, I love watching the character development in the next 5 books. And it only takes place, it's like a year and a half of time as opposed to the 4 years of the PJO series or whatever it is. The character development is unmatched and I love it so much. This came out, I'm pretty sure the Heroes of Olympus was coming out junior high school for me. So this was now in the territory where it like wasn't super cool to be reading Percy Jackson. And I remember distinctly trying so hard to act like I didn't care. But every time one of the books came out, I had to read it. I was so invested. I was a little bit of a closet reader for this, but shamelessly, I've picked that series up so many times. I didn't read it as many times as I read the PJO series. Like I didn't have as much time on my hands anymore because I was a little bit older. I had more responsibilities, jobs, things like that. But I've read that series, I think 5 to 10 times in my existence. And since the books have been out, I think I like this one more because you get to see out of Percy's head. You get to know and love other characters within the stories. Like, he's not the only main character. And even though he's a phenomenal main character, you get to see growth in other characters as well. Again, the same person who made Potterless is also making a Percy Jackson podcast where he's doing the same thing. These series, he's made his way all the way through the PJO books. He's now on Heroes of Olympus. I think he's in Son of Neptune right now. So we're all in like the best territory. We're entering the prime of the series. And so I'll be completely honest and shameless when I admit that I love revisiting these stories. The reason that this one is number one is because this is one that I still think holds as a phenomenal series to read. And even if you're an adult, I think this would be a lot of fun to read. PJO is very much like a middle grade. And while that still holds true, Percy Jackson is more of that YA, or that Heroes of Olympus is that YA, you still get a lot of emotional growth and development that anyone can enjoy. You don't have to be 12 to think it's a good book. You know what I mean? I think anyone would benefit from reading it. It's a great series. If you've got young readers who are looking for a book to read, it would be a great one to talk about. There's a lot of bigger themes that you can explore with young readers, things like that. So I can't say enough good about it. These are the books that inspired me as a child and as a young person, and I still think they hold as good series today, even though I'm not a child anymore. I'm old and decrepit. But if you have read these books, or if your children have read these books, please share your thoughts down below. I would love to chat about them. I think they're a lot of fun. Anything that you do to interact with this video helps. So liking videos, commenting down below, subscribing to my channel would mean a lot. Any way that you interact helps me as a newbie channel out a ton. So let me know if there's anything that you want to see. I'm trying out a lot of different types of videos right now. I'm trying out different locations in my home. So any sort of feedback that you have, please let me know. I will see you next time.